Slowly pull the camera back from today's America, from skyscrapers, the Hollywood sign, NASA rockets on the launch pad. At first glance, what you see might look like nothing more than a giant country, a giant economy, a playground of popular culture. But beneath this massive structure lie starving colonies, towns crushed under taxes, narrow muddy streets where secret revolutionaries whisper in the shadows, lawyers, farmers, and craftsmen living every day under the fear of the gallows. Today I'm taking you right into the heart of that huge and complicated story, the founding of the United States of America. It is the story of people who were born in the shadow of an empire, squeezed by taxes, and who, tired of being loyal subjects, decided they wanted to be citizens instead. And before we dive in, I have a small but very important request. If you enjoy history told in a long, detailed, story-like way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is what helps these long, carefully crafted videos reach more people. If you're ready, let's roll time back to the foggy, smoky ports of the 1700s, to the burdened colonies, to that boiling pot where revolution was slowly being cooked. The story of America's founding actually begins in a time when there was no such thing as a United States of America. In the north of the continent, there were indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. Algonquins, the Iroquois Confederacy, Cherokee, Sioux, hundreds of tribes, different languages, different beliefs, different ways of life. For the first Europeans who came here, this place was the New World. But that new world had already been someone else's home for a very long time. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Spaniards, Portuguese, French, and Dutch all took their turn. But the power that truly planted deep and lasting roots on the eastern coast of North America was England. The ships crossing the Atlantic from the other side carried not only people, goods, and hopes. They also carried Europe's political rivalries, economic ambitions, and religious conflicts. First, small colonies were established on the coast. Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, then Massachusetts, where Puritans fleeing religious persecution settled, followed by New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Georgia, and others. As Britain's 13 colonies took shape in North America, few could have guessed that these scattered settlements would one day unite to found a state that would become a global superpower. At the beginning, life in these colonies was shockingly simple and brutally hard. Land, survival, and a little bit of freedom. Those who came to the new continent cleared forests, opened fields, and built small towns. Some had fled religious pressure, some the weight of debt, some were chasing adventure, and others crossed the Atlantic chasing dreams of wealth. But over this new life there was always a shadow, sometimes faint, sometimes heavy. The distant but very real power of the British Crown and Parliament in London. For Britain, the colonies meant both trade routes and strategic power. Colonial ships carried sugar, tobacco, cotton, furs, lumber, fish, and grain. In return, they bought cloth, metal goods, weapons, and luxury items from England. For a while, this arrangement kind of worked for everyone. The colonies thought, as long as we can have our local assemblies and feel relatively free, London doesn't need to interfere too much. The British thought, you are our colonies, we set the rules of trade. But in history, no balance lasts forever. In the mid-18th century, the world turned into a battlefield where great powers clashed. Britain and France were rivals not only in Europe but also in North America. Wars broke out in forests, around forts, with indigenous nations taking sides. One particular conflict would directly shape the story of America's founding, the 7 Years' War and its North American front, known as the French and Indian War. Britain eventually emerged victorious, but its treasury was nearly emptied. War is expensive. Soldiers, weapons, supplies, fleets, everything costs money. British leaders asked themselves, for whom did we fight this war? To protect the colonies. So who should pay for it? Obviously the colonies. And the crisis really began right there. After the war, Britain decided to increase economic pressure on the colonies. It was tax time. Politicians in London passed laws that seemed perfectly logical on paper. The Stamp Act, which taxed official documents, newspapers, even playing cards. The Sugar Act, the Tea Act, and more. From the British point of view, this was normal. The colonies benefited from the protection of the British Army. That protection had a price, and that price was taxes. But imagine this from the point of view of a colonial merchant. Someone who had spent years building a business, taken huge risks, carved out a life in a raw wilderness, and just as things seemed stable, a paper arrives from London saying, "From now on, you will pay a stamp tax on this document." On top of that, the colonies had almost no real representation in Parliament. One phrase began to circulate like a spark among the colonists: no taxation without representation. If there was no one in London who spoke for them, if they had no real say in the laws that governed them, why should they obey those laws, especially when they involved taxes? To the colonists, these were not just about a few extra coins. These new taxes exposed a deeper question. Were they still just loyal British subjects living far from the island? Or were they becoming something else, something like a separate political community with its own identity? Discontent simmered in the streets. But the rebellion wasn't only at the street level. Local assemblies, taverns, coffee houses, warehouses near the docks, and secret meeting rooms were full of heated discussions. Lawyers, doctors, merchants, farmers, printers sat together and asked, "Where is this going? Are we equal citizens of the empire, or just a convenient source of raw materials and tax revenue?" From this atmosphere, certain names began to emerge: Samuel Adams, John Adams, Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin. Men who later would be known as Founding Fathers were at that moment simply very angry, very intelligent, and very determined colonists. And all it would take was a spark to turn these tensions into open flame. That spark came in Boston. Boston was one of the most sensitive pressure points in the British colonial relationship. Its port was busy, trade brisk, but taxes, inspections, and the presence of British soldiers made everyday life heavy and tense. In 1770, one tense night on Boston streets, it all exploded. Craftsmen, dock workers, laborers, everyday people confronted British soldiers, the human face of taxation and imperial power. Insults escalated, stones were thrown, confusion reigned, and suddenly shots rang out. What exactly happened and who fired first is still debated, but the result is clear. Several colonists lay dead on the street. This event quickly became known as the Boston Massacre. Engraved images were printed and passed around. Pamphlets turned it into a powerful piece of propaganda. For the British, it was an unfortunate incident. For the colonists, it was the bloody face of tyranny. But the real explosion was yet to come. In 1773, Parliament passed a law regulating tea trade that undercut certain colonial merchants. Tea stopped being a simple drink and turned into a political symbol. In Boston, a group of colonists painted their faces, dressed like Native Americans, and secretly boarded British ships in the harbor. In the chill night air, they smashed open crates and dumped tons of tea into the dark water. This dramatic protest entered history as the Boston Tea Party. It was no longer just about tax, it was a direct act of defiance. They were effectively saying, "We reject not only your tea, but the authority behind it." The British government was furious. They decided the colonies, especially Boston, needed to be disciplined. Boston's port was closed, Massachusetts' self-government was restricted, more troops were sent. These harsh measures had an unintended effect. They united the colonies in fear and anger. People in other colonies began to think, what's happening to Boston today could happen to us tomorrow. For the first time, the leaders of the 13 colonies decided to act together. In 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. At this point, most of the delegates weren't openly calling for full independence. Many still claimed loyalty to King George III, but argued that Parliament's policies were unjust. Their initial aim was to defend their rights within the empire, not to break away entirely. But history has a way of narrowing options. Sometimes problems reach a point where compromise is no longer enough, and a decision that once seemed unthinkable becomes the only path forward. All it would take to push the colonists toward that point was an armed clash. That clash came at Lexington and Concord. In the spring of 1775, British troops marched out to seize colonial weapons and ammunition stores. But by then, the colonists had organized militias, known as Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. On the village green at Lexington, colonial militiamen and British soldiers faced each other. No one knows for sure who fired the first shot, but history remembers it as the shot heard round the world. Gunfire shattered the morning silence, men fell, and the British column moved on to Concord, only to encounter stronger resistance. Local militiamen fired from behind trees, stone walls, and fences. The British troops, harassed and bleeding, were forced into a difficult retreat back to Boston. This was no longer a dispute about taxes. It was open war. The colonies had sent a message: if we have to, we will fight. The Second Continental Congress, again meeting in Philadelphia, now bore an even heavier burden. This was no longer about sending petitions to the king. It was about organizing a real war effort, creating an army, and confronting the greatest military power of the era. At this key moment, one figure stepped into the spotlight: George Washington. Washington was a wealthy planter, a former soldier, stern yet charismatic. When he entered Congress in his military uniform, many delegates felt they had found the commander they needed. In 1775, Washington was appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. For the first time, the colonies had a unified force, at least on paper. But in reality, that army was a fragile, struggling force. Most of the men weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, hunters, artisans. Supplies were scarce. Weapons, gunpowder, uniforms, tents, boots, everything was in short supply. Winters were cruel, and the British Army was one of the best in the world. Disciplined, experienced, and well-equipped. On paper, Britain should have crushed the rebellion. But history doesn't always follow the logic of raw power. Human determination, clever strategy, risky alliances, and a bit of luck can change the game. While the war raged on, a revolution was taking place in the realm of ideas. Did the colonies truly want complete independence from Britain? For many people, that still seemed extreme. Being British at that time meant being part of what was seen as the most advanced, civilized nation. Into this uncertainty stepped a pamphlet that changed minds: Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Paine's writing was sharp and simple. He asked, why should a vast continent forever remain the child of a small island? Why should an entire people submit to a monarchy based on birthright? He argued that kings were not sacred, they were just men, and their power came from tradition, not justice. If the government violates the people's rights, then the people have the right to change that government. Copies of Common Sense spread quickly. People read it in taverns, homes, and meetings. It turned scattered frustration into a coherent argument for separation. Under the pressure of war and the influence of these new ideas, the Continental Congress decided to take an irreversible step. They would declare independence. In the summer of 1776, in the heat of Philadelphia, in a building that would later be called Independence Hall, delegates debated the wording of one of the most famous documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. The primary author, a young lawyer and planter named Thomas Jefferson, crafted a text that did more than say, "We're leaving Britain." It set out principles that would echo across centuries. At the heart of the Declaration is a powerful claim: all men are created equal. They are endowed with unalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments exist to secure these rights, and their just powers come from the consent of the governed. If any government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it and to institute a new one. In the context of the 18th century, this was radical. It challenged the divine right of kings and placed legitimacy firmly with the people. Jefferson went on to list grievances against King George III: unfair taxes, stationing troops without consent, interfering with colonial assemblies, and more. On July 4, 1776, the delegations of most colonies agreed to this text. By signing it, they were not just criticizing policy, they were committing treason in the eyes of Britain. That date became what is now celebrated as the birthday of the United States of America. But writing your independence on a piece of paper is one thing. Convincing the empire to accept it is another. Britain did not shrug and say, "All right, good luck with your new country." Instead, it tightened its fists and prepared to crush the rebellion. The American Revolutionary War intensified. The early years of the war were brutal for the Americans. British forces captured key cities, including New York. Many battles ended in defeat. Morale sank. Washington struggled constantly to keep his army intact. Soldiers deserted when pay was late, when food ran out, when winter bit into their bones. But even in these dark times, there were moments of daring that kept hope alive. One of them came at the end of 1776. On a freezing winter night, Washington led his men across the icy Delaware River in a surprise move. At dawn, they attacked the enemy forces at Trenton. Though a relatively small engagement in terms of numbers, it had enormous psychological impact. It proved that the American army could still strike, still win. The real turning point, however, was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. There, a British force suffered a serious defeat at the hands of the American troops. This victory didn't just lift American spirits, it changed how the rest of the world viewed the conflict. Watching from across the ocean, France saw an opportunity. Old rivalries with Britain were very much alive. French leaders asked themselves, if these colonists can really stand up to Britain, why not help them and weaken our old enemy? Eventually, France decided to openly join the American side. French support changed everything. They provided money, arms, and officers. Figures like the Marquis de Lafayette became legendary in America. Even more crucially, the French Navy began to challenge British power at sea. The war was no longer just a rebellion. It was part of a global struggle between empires. Back in America, the home front was under immense stress. Inflation soared, food shortages spread, and political quarrels flared up. The winter at Valley Forge became a symbol of this hardship. The conditions were horrifying: inadequate shelter, disease, hunger, soldiers marching barefoot in the snow. Yet the army did not dissolve. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, the troops became more disciplined and effective. All of these struggles led to the decisive moments of 1781 at Yorktown. British General Cornwallis found his forces trapped there. On land, American and French troops tightened the noose. At sea, the French fleet blocked British support. Surrounded and outmaneuvered, Cornwallis surrendered. When news of Yorktown reached London, the political winds shifted. Many in the British government realized that continuing the war would be costly and perhaps pointless. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. On paper and in the eyes of the world, a new nation now existed on the far side of the Atlantic. But our story doesn't end there. Winning independence is one thing. Building a stable country is another. During the war, the colonies had operated under the Articles of Confederation, a system that created a loose union of states. Under these articles, the central government was extremely weak. It struggled to raise money, regulate trade, or enforce decisions. After the war, when the immediate threat disappeared, the weaknesses of this system became painfully obvious. Debts piled up, the economy stumbled, and states sometimes acted more like rival countries than parts of a single nation. Smoldering tensions, local uprisings, and international uncertainty pushed American leaders to ask a hard question. If we don't create a stronger, more balanced system of government, could this new republic fall apart? In response to this anxiety, delegates gathered once more in Philadelphia in 1787. This time, their goal was not to write another petition or a wartime stopgap, but to design a durable framework for government. The U.S. Constitution. The debates were intense. How much power should the central government have? How much should remain with the states? How would representation be handled? By population, by state, or both? How would they prevent any single branch of government from becoming too powerful? Out of these debates emerged the principles of separation of powers and checks and balances. Legislative, executive, and judicial branches were created to limit and oversee each other. A federal system was established, sharing authority between the national government and the states. But the convention also dodged some of the era's darkest questions. The most glaring contradiction was slavery. The same nation that proclaimed that all men are created equal tolerated human bondage across many states. This hypocritical reality was pushed aside, treated as an issue for the future. Compromises were made. Painful, unjust compromises that would later explode into a catastrophic civil war. Even so, the Constitution became a foundational document. Soon after, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added to guarantee certain individual freedoms: freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to assemble, the right to bear arms, protections against unjust searches and unfair trials. These rights, although not equally applied at first and denied to many groups, still articulated a powerful ideal that government should serve the people and that citizens have rights that no ruler should easily violate. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. He was not just a general anymore. He became the living symbol of the new republic. One of his most important acts was what he refused to do. He chose not to run for a third term. By stepping down voluntarily, he set a precedent that leaders should not cling to power indefinitely. This was a quiet but profound lesson in Republican virtue. A new capital city was planned along the Potomac River. Over time, this city would be called Washington, D.C., and it would become the physical heart of the new nation's politics. At this early stage, the United States was nothing like the superpower we know today. It was smaller, weaker, hemmed in by European empires and native nations, full of unsolved problems and deep internal contradictions. Yet its existence sent a powerful message to the world. A people had risen up against a monarchy, founded a republic, and managed, against the odds, to hold it together. From the French Revolution to the independence movements of Latin America, many looked at America's founding story either as a source of inspiration or as a cautionary tale. When we say the founding of America, we're not just talking about a single date or a single document. We're talking about a long and painful process that stretches from the first colonies to tax crises, from the Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party to the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, from freezing nights at Valley Forge to the victories at Saratoga and Yorktown, from the ink drying on the Treaty of Paris to the sleepless debates in Philadelphia that produced the Constitution. The heroes of this story were not only famous generals and thinkers. They were also farmers, plowing their fields under the threat of war. Dockworkers loading and unloading ships in busy harbors, printers running pamphlets off their presses late into the night, ordinary people reading political texts by candlelight, mothers burying sons lost in battle, anonymous soldiers shivering on sentry duty in the snow. When we look at the United States today, if we see only the bright surface, its wealth, its culture, its influence, we miss the depth of its origin. Its founding story is a tangle of lofty ideals and stark contradictions, grand speeches and grave injustices, brave steps forward and painful compromises. And my friend, if you've stayed with me all the way through this long journey, that means you're someone who doesn't just want quick summaries, but wants to understand the roots and the depths of history. If you enjoyed this detailed, narrative-style exploration, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hitting the like button helps YouTube show these kinds of history videos to more people, and that support motivates us to prepare even more comprehensive content. Drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think was the real turning point in America's founding story? The Boston Tea Party, Saratoga, the Declaration of Independence, or the ratification of the Constitution? Maybe in a future video, we'll take your comments and build a deeper episode around that discussion. And if you want to keep traveling through the back alleys of history, uncovering hidden details and forgotten stories together, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Maybe our next journey will take us to the bloody barricades of the French Revolution, to the turning points of the Ottoman reforms, or to the independent struggles of Latin America. Thank you for watching and listening. See you on our next trip through history.